Already read Act 2, Scene 1 of Shakespeare's Measure for Measure and keen to develop an even more detailed understanding? You're in the right place. Stay tuned, you're watching Schofield on Shakespeare.
Abbiamo il cuore a strisce, portaci dove vuoi.
Time for my summary of this reasonably chaotic scene. It begins with a serious discussion about Claudio's sentencing between Angelo and Aeschylus. The former is keen to justify himself, pointing out that the law needs to be feared and occasionally implemented for effect. He goes on to make a series of other points, including that just because you are tempted, that doesn't mean you need to act upon illicit desires, and just because a thief may be part of a jury doesn't mean that the law itself is unsound. Meanwhile, Aeschylus is clearly less than convinced by Angelo's arguments and suggests that the punishment needs to more carefully fit the crime. By all means punish Claudio and others like him, but metaphorically cutting may be more fitting than a dramatic, swooping death sentence. Perhaps Aeschylus's intervention here has the opposite effect to that intended, for Angelo decides to call for Claudio to be executed the very next morning. Following Aeschylus's bitter reflections, we shift to more conventional Shakespearean comedy and the hapless constable Elbow. He has brought two prisoners with him, Pompey and Froth, and wants them to be brought to justice. The trouble is that clear communication is not his forte. Not only does he struggle to make it clear exactly what the pair have done, it would appear to be that Froth has slept with his, i.e. Elbow's wife, whilst Pompey has been operating as a pimp. But his linguistic errors make him a source of mockery for the audience and the characters on stage. His use of malapropisms provide particular humour and include him unwittingly declaring that he hates his wife, detest, attest, and that had this wife been religiously inclined, she might have been accused of sexual misconduct, cardinally, carnally. Whereas Angelo quickly loses patience with all of this and leaves his second in command to deal with it all, Aeschylus seems more amused. Ultimately, he lets off Froth with a gentle warning about the dangers of spending time in bars, particularly those run by pimps. Pompey is dismissed with a stronger warning, following his indirect spirited support for the naturalness of sex and procreation. And Elbow is asked to bring suitable candidates who might succeed him, following his 7.5 years of faithful, but if this scene is anything to go by, incompetent service. For you. Here are some questions for you to consider. I would recommend pausing the video in a moment to write some detailed paragraphs of your own before continuing the video to consider my ideas. So grab your pen, press pause. The video will resume in 5 seconds time. Question 1. Explore the different attitudes towards justice and the law as presented in this scene. An interesting question and a key theme in the play as a whole. What different attitudes are presented within Act 2, Scene 1? Well, let's kick off with the attitude shown by the new dictator-in-chief, Angelo. Already in conversation with his number 2, Aeschylus, as the scene starts, Angelo's language suggests that he believes the law should strike fear into the ordinary citizen so that they behave themselves. Scarecrows, initially at least, scare away birds intent on naughty pecking and stealing, hence the name. Angelo's imagery here suggests that he feels familiarity with how the law is, and more crucially isn't, implemented on the part of the citizen has led to contempt and misuse. Just as birds over time realise that a scarecrow isn't going to do them any harm, so human beings with the potential to scavenge and do things they shouldn't have figuratively begun to swarm all over the laws of the land and do whatever they please. And this is something Angelo disagrees with and wants to put right. He wants the law to be held up in reverence, to frighten folk into behaving themselves. Angelo's words here back up what the Duke admitted in Act 1, Scene 3, that over time, implementation of the law has slackened, resulting in a Vienna which is dissolute and, to some extent, out of control. Thus, the implication is that both men feel that laws are needed to control and govern, and that without necessary laws and the dispensing of justice, a significant number of human beings would choose to behave badly. The animal imagery in both quotations on the screen implicitly emphasises the potential dissolute savagery of human beings. Rather than naturally civilised folk, we are eagles and ospreys and worn-out horses. We need the direction and good order provided by a working, forceful legal system. In this scene, you can also see Angelo keen to distance himself and the human element from justice and the law. With the lines on screen, note the personification of justice and its positioning as the subject of the clause. Essentially, Angelo is suggesting that it is the legal system itself which hunts down, pounces upon opportunities to implement justice and, by extension, punish transgressors. And in doing so, the implication is that no human judgment call should be needed. Justice is presented as an omnipotent force for control, which is needed to keep society in good order. Of course, this attempt to remove the human element from the dispensing of justice is very convenient for Angelo when he has decided to re-implement a particular law on fornication, which, according to Claudio, has been ignored for 19 years. Thus, we get a sense of Angelo having a brutally and unhelpfully black and white picture of the law. All laws are laws, and all laws need to be followed. There is no sense of any acceptance that, over time, it may be necessary to tweak and evolve, or at least use a degree of judgment when determining how and whether to implement particular punishments. Such an attitude would appear to be held by Aeschylus. He too, like the Duke and Angelo, recognises that the law needs to be used to punish. But his imagery here suggests that there needs to be a more thoughtful, nuanced approach. With a crime such as Claudio's, which at least stems from natural, ordinary desires, a figurative cutting, rather than wielding an axe to sledgehammer down a tree, may be more appropriate. Aeschylus has already been confirmed as an expert in the laws of Vienna. He will know that, technically speaking, the sentence for fornication is death. However, he also wants to use his own brain and judgment before going full steam ahead with any beheading. His recognition of Claudio's background slightly masks his own feelings of compassion. Seen clearly within the daring subordinate clause, daring as Aeschylus obviously doesn't want to irritate or upset the newly all-powerful Angelo too much. So whereas Angelo wants to go full speed ahead with implementing justice, irrespective of whether the punishment really fits the crime, and being seen to implement justice, Aeschylus wants to think and reflect. For him, the law is not a brutal dictating power from above, but something which should be used and interpreted by those in power. Pompey, Mistress Overdone's helper, also gives his views on justice and the law in this scene, albeit indirectly. Within the lines on screen, Pompey's slightly enigmatic response about whether promoting prostitution is lawful implies his own belief that the law should not be a rigid, fixed entity. The if clause indirectly emphasises the fact that laws and certain interpretations of laws need not be set in stone. Leaders such as the Duke, Aeschylus and Angelo should also be lawmakers and law moulders, not just blind, non-thinking sheep. Laws may need to evolve to fit current times and contexts, and Pompey here gently seems to be suggesting this. As well as implying that rulers have the power to change and evolve laws, Pompey emphasises the importance of a realistic approach to law enforcement. Responding to Aeschylus indicating that from this point onwards, those who fornicate will be beheaded, typically for those of a higher class, or hung, those from a lower class. He argues that this has the potential to decimate the city's population, resulting in the best houses becoming available for ridiculously low rates. Thus, Pompey is drawing attention to the problems inherent in having such a drastic punishment for such a natural pastime. He is clearly advocating a more measured approach and suggesting that the law on fornication is at best outdated or worse, utterly ridiculous.
Question 2. Explore the dynamics between Elbow and his prisoners. How do we as an audience react to these characters? Well, on a basic level, the answer to this question is very simple. Elbow may be the constable, but he is also utterly hapless and moronic, and so ends up being made a fool of partly by himself and partly by his prisoners, Pompey and Froth. We laugh at dear Elbow and am secretly quite impressed by the brazen Pompey. But let's look at this in closer detail.
What's important to note is how much Elbow speaks initially and how little the two prisoners speak. In my Arden edition, the three enter from line 41, and for the first 40 lines, Elbow has 235 words as he tries to explain to Angelo and Aeschylus why he has brought two prisoners to them. Froth says nothing, and Pompey has just 7 words. And from a very early stage, Elbow makes himself an object of ridicule. In just his second speech, he causes confusion and hilarity with the malapropism benefactors when he means the opposite, malefactors. One speech mishap is unlikely to affect how people respond to you a great deal. However, multiple speech calamities is a different matter. And so, when Elbow follows on with a blunder about the prisoners being villains, and remember, this would have been seen as far more of an insult in Shakespeare's time, hence the proliferation of definitions within ShakespeareWords.com, who are pious and free from sin, the stage is set. Elbow has sealed his own fate, and simply by enjoying listening and saying nothing, the prisoners are moving into a position of strength. Elbow's repeated blunders imply his own incompetence and, by extension, his inability to justify significant punishment for prisoners better than anything Pompey or Elbow might say. That said, Pompey seems rather like Lucio in his inability to hold his tongue for too long, and it is notable that his first utterance in this scene is a punning joke at Elbow's expense. He takes an opportunity for a quip with the lines on screen. The phrase outer elbow means without the brains to respond. However, Pompey remains cautious early on not to attempt to dominate the conversation. And when he finds another opportunity to get involved, he moves from a punning joke to obfuscation. Talking about Elbow's pregnant wife, he embarks upon a tortuously tedious narrative full of irrelevant details. Pompey's task is to defend himself from accusations of being a bawd, yet instead he gives a series of incidental details about Constable Elbow's wife's arrival at his place of work. He mentions a culinary preference for stewed prunes and the fact that they didn't have many left, but the ones they did have were in a type of dish, about which he proceeds to give further details. This exasperates his listeners and presumably amuses the audience. But already the sense we are getting is that a man with such limited linguistic means as Elbow is unlikely to be able to get the better of someone who has the confidence and wit to mercilessly waste the time of men in positions of authority, whilst taking plenty of opportunities to lace his dialogue with double entendres. We are likely to be amused with his cheekiness towards Aeschylus, when the older man calls out in frustration for Pompey to get to the point, to finally elucidate the exact reason why Elbow has dragged the pair of them there to be brought to justice. He deliberately misinterprets the question to assume that Aeschylus is asking for salacious sexual details. Within the lines on screen, stewed prunes were thought to be helpful in the fight against syphilis, and so more widely reference prostitutes, whilst china dishes may also be a lewd pun given the similarity in shape between a dish and a vagina. So we as an audience are likely to be attracted to Pompey's vivacity in spite of the circumstances he finds himself in, and remember that he is now living in a world in which another man is set to be put to death just for impregnating the modern equivalent of a nailed-on fiancé. Just as in Act 1, Scene 2, done is interpreted more explicitly as a euphemism for had sex with, so here Pompey uses the same meaning to suggest that Aeschylus needs to wait for the juicy details, to hear them within the natural sequence of the account. But of course the original question asks for the dynamics between Elbow and the prisoners, and the audience's reaction, whereas I have generally been exploring the different ways they have been interacting predominantly with Angelo and Aeschylus. Well, verbal language is not the only form of communication available on stage. For instance, you would imagine the actors playing Froth and Pompey to be sharing sniggers with the audience during Elbow's malapropisms, or Elbow firing angry looks or even shaking over-the-top fists in Pompey's direction as he talks about his wife's apparent preference for stewed prunes. However, it is clear that Pompey and Froth do team up effectively, with the latter backing up the former as he waffles irrelevantly. Froth's "Aye, so I did indeed," and "all this is true," provide comic confirmation of totally unimportant details, whilst also giving the impression that he may not be that bright, hence the appropriateness of his name. So the two are a united team, and clearly treat Elbow as someone to be brushed aside and disregarded. As the scene continues, Elbow gets more worked up. With the lines on screen, you can see Elbow's rage in his use of the term varlet and his frantic repetition. However, why is he so angry? Well, it is because he believes that his wife has been insulted. However, Pompey has simply picked up upon and then taken Elbow's malapropism of respected when he means suspected to make another joke at Elbow's expense. Elbow thinks that Pompey is saying that his wife is the biggest suspect wrongdoer of them all, and Pompey knows that Elbow would think that. Whereas ironically, he is saying the truth about her, that compared to himself and the other whorehouse customers or workers, she is far more respectable. So Pompey is simply far too clever for Elbow, and a telltale sign of his improbably commanding position, remember he is the prisoner and Elbow is the constable, is shown when even Aeschylus joins in with his malapropism mocking. As well as his error substituting Hannibal for cannibal, Elbow vows that he'll take legal action against Pompey for battery, which is, of course, related to physical assault rather than verbal. When Aeschylus responds humorously that a physical assault might give him the opportunity to bring legal action for slander, Pompey will be thinking job done. His own obfuscations, quick thinking one-liners, and above all, Elbow's clear deficiencies have ultimately resulted in a light-hearted atmosphere in which suspected wrong-uns will be let off with a mere warning. This light-heartedness is clearly seen in the 2015 Globe on Screen production of the play, in which Mistress Overdone joins the action on stage in this scene. She repeatedly ad-libs, calling out that Elbow's name is Pig Fucker after he has introduced himself to Angelo and Aeschylus. And she also drunkenly roars with laughter when he first mentions his wife, crying, "His wife stinks!" But the clearest signal of all in this production that we needn't waste time feeling sorry for the mocked Elbow comes when he actually snogs Mistress Overdone, following his confirmation that his wife might have been accused of various things by Mistress Overdone's means. This strikes me as typical Globe fare. Yes, your costumes, settings, and the majority of lines need to be faithful, but you also need to entertain a modern audience with a significant proportion of tourists who may be seeing Shakespeare for the first time. Shakespeare intended this scene to be light-hearted, but modern audiences may not pick up the majority of references, e.g. all those ones to china dishes, prunes, and hot houses. However, good old-fashioned horseplay always goes down well live, and so this can, to some extent, make up for the lack of understanding of the language. Other productions, notably David Thacker's 1994 TV version of the play, simply decided to cut Elbow out altogether, preferring to focus even more sharply on the dynamics between Isabella and Angelo. This strikes me as a shame. I always think these comic interludes provide welcome contrast and perspective to more intense moments, such as in the following scene when we realise, open-mouthed, that Angelo has fallen for that persuasive nun-in-training, Isabella.
This has been a Schofield on Shakespeare production, imploring you to think in a little bit more detail about Act 2, Scene 1 of Shakespeare's Measure for Measure. Many thanks for watching.